Thank you, Lyndon.
What I shall do today is present the evolution of the policy which is presented to us by the coming visit of the President of China. The history of it, as I was personally involved in developing that policy over a long period of time, partly as a personal effort and later as an effort which began to make some impact on the shaping of the policies of the world during the course of the 1980s. The one thing that has to be said, to put this in perspective, this is not a U.S. China policy. This is a policy for the survival and recovery of the world. This civilization in its present form, if it continues in this form, is doomed. We are headed under present policies, world trends. We're headed toward a collapse of civilization to occur probably by the end of this century. The Black Monday, which erupted in Asia this past Monday, accidentally, in a sense, echoing what had happened 10 years earlier on the so-called 1987 October financial crash. That is a world event. Even though much money was poured into markets in the United States and Britain and continent of Europe to try to prevent Black Monday from exploding immediately here, Black Monday exploded, and as we stand here, is continuing to explode in Asia. The collapse of these markets is ongoing. This is not an Asian problem. This is a problem for Asia, but it is not an Asian problem. In the recent period, especially during the past period since 1989, under the influence of Margaret Thatcher, George Bush, and Francois Mitterrand, who unloaded the policy of globalization, a post-Soviet world of globalization upon the world, world markets are so interconnected, intertwined, that there is no longer any protection, with the qualified exception of China. There's no longer any protection by any nation state or its economy from the ravages of things that break out in the international financial market. An explosion in one market, one financial market, if it's severe, is an explosion in every market. Already we see today that the economy of Europe is beginning to disintegrate, another ratchet step, as a result of the explosion which occurred Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday in East and South Asia. This is an interconnected world. No part can be protected from the diseases which rage in another part of the world. What happens to any part of the world happens to us. Black Monday in Asia happened in the United States, and only people living in delusions can imagine otherwise. Now, the gentleman who is coming to Washington, not for a U.S. China negotiation, but for an attempt to reach a partnership between the leading military power of the world and the largest nation of the world, and a partnership on which the survival of civilization depends. That is, the success of this attempt at partnership will determine whether civilization outlives this century. Now let's look at some of the fortunate features of this. The President of China, of whom I have limited knowledge, but what I know of his education and what I've seen of his character publicly, is the outstanding figure among heads of state and heads of government in any part of the world today. There is no person presently a head of state or a head of government in any part of the world who has the personal stature and depth of character of the President of China, who happens to be the head of not a world power, but of a great power in the world and a regional power. And therefore, we are very fortunate to have one of the world's powers, the head of China, who happens to be probably the outstanding head of state of any nation in the world today in terms of educational and personal qualities, coming here. This is a man who, but for comparison, has no comparison in the past 25 years among heads of state and government. A man who belongs to the same rank as Europe will remember in terms of President de Gaulle of France or Chancellor Adenauer of Germany, or in a sense, President Kennedy of the United States. This is a great world figure who has come to the top to represent a great nation. A partnership between the President of the United States and the President of China and what he represents is one of the greatest opportunities for turning the world around and beginning to move the world in a new direction under which conditions civilization can survive, as it cannot if we continue to go the way we want to go. If we continue to go the way that Congress is trying to push us, if we continue to go the way the British Empire is pushing us. But China has many problems, but its problems are essentially a legacy of the world's problems. And it cannot solve its problems by China methods alone. It requires partners just as we in the United States require partners without which we cannot solve our problems. Therefore, this is the greatest occasion of this decade is now occurring next week in the arrival of the President of China to deal with the President of the United States. Okay, but China's position is not all rosy. Let's look at the first chart. This was a chart which we produced for a cover of EIR some time ago. China is the last surviving power on this planet which is not disintegrating. Every other part of the world is disintegrating. Europe is disintegrating. The United States economy has been in collapse since, in fact, in physical terms, since 1970. That is, the per capita physical market basket standard of productivity. By that standard, the per capita income of the labor force has dropped to about 1/2 today of what it was in the late 1960s. The productivity of labor, measured in the same terms, has dropped to approximately 1/2 today of what it was 25 odd years ago. Europe has collapsed, especially since 1989. If you take the productivity of Europe as a whole, or Western Europe, since 1989, there has been a savage collapse, presently accelerating in the economies throughout Europe. The United Kingdom itself is a junk heap. It's a garbage dump. There's no power in England, but there's great power in the British Commonwealth and the financial institutions that it represents, the combination of financial oligarchical interests. China, on the other hand, has in recent years, over the course of the 1980s and during the 1990s, has had a contrary trend. China is the leading power of the world, the only one which has had an upward course in economic development in the recent period. There have been some interesting developments in Southeast Asia, but actually the Southeast Asia development, the so-called Asia Tiger development, is a form of neo-colonialism. Remember, in the 19th century, the colonial powers, and even in the 18th century, but the 19th century, the colonial powers led by Britain would go into a country and they would loot its mines and they would loot its agriculture for the benefit of the imperial powers. So therefore, the investment in mines and plantations by the British, French, Dutch, and Portuguese empires, for example, did not benefit the people of the country in which these investments were made. The investment in slave labor or virtual slave labor by the European powers and the U.S. in Southeast Asia was not of long-term benefit to the people of the nations of those countries. Because to invest in cheap labor shops, in so-called runaway shops, or as the NAFTA operation below our borders from the United States, does not benefit these countries. For example, in Mexico and throughout South America, the per capita income of peoples is half or worse what it was even as late as recently as 1982. NAFTA has been a disaster, not only for the people and the economy of the United States, but for the people of Mexico and South America. Things are much worse as a result of NAFTA than they were before. And it was getting worse since 1982. The Southeast Asia Tiger Miracles is part of this runaway shop operation into cheap labor markets, a hit-and-run operation in the same spirit as the plantation operations and mining operations, looting operations of the imperial colonial powers during the 19th century. So China is special in that sense. It has some of this, it has some runaway shops, it has some cheap labor operations, but overall there's a movement in China which is upward. The only nation state on this planet which has had an upward movement of this type during the past decade and over a longer period. Now, you recall what happened in 1989, that I'll come to again. But since 1989, the former Soviet Union and the nations associated with it have collapsed. For example, the conditions of life in the eastern part of Germany, the former East Germany today, are savagely worse than they were under communism. Throughout Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, the conditions of life are savagely worse than they were under communism, and they're rapidly becoming much worse. This did not happen accidentally. It happened because certain powers decided to do that to that part of the world. For example, Maastricht was imposed upon Germany, not to develop the eastern part of Germany as a condition of reunification, and not to do anything which would allow the former Soviet Union or Eastern Europe to recover or to grow after the 1989-1991 period. The intent of the people who did that to the former Soviet Union, especially from London, the intent is to do the same thing to China. China is the only power from the pre-1989 period, the only power which has not been destroyed, or largely destroyed, and they intend to do that. Now, that doesn't mean that some of these people in London or in Western Europe or the United States, the enemies of China, do not intend to do business with China. Yes, they want the business. George Bush, for example, who represents the enemies of China today in terms of present policy, makes commissions anywhere he can on Asia trade. Other people make profit on business deals with China. But they do not want a partnership between the United States and China, a partnership of nations which might secure the long-term economic strength and stability of China. The intent of London, the intent of the British Commonwealth, is to do to China what they did to the Soviet Union. That's their policy. Above all, they do not wish to allow the United States to enter into a partnership with China, which is an alliance, in effect, among two nations seeking to find global stability and global economic growth. And thus, China is besieged and threatened on every border. That's changing. What's happened in Taiwan recently with George Soros and company collapsing the Taiwanese economy as he participated in collapsing the Southeast Asia economies has had a political effect in Taiwan. But from every part of Asia, we can trace British intelligence operations, supported in part by some scoundrels from the United States, such as George Bush and his brother Prescott, which are attacking China, trying to destroy it. You have a pro-British faction in Japan, which wants to make trouble. You have in the Congress members of the Congress who never had a passport before the end of the Congress. And they're now trying to make foreign policy. Most of them don't even know where countries outside the United States are. But they have strong opinions on the subject. Their ignorance strengthens their opinion. There's instability in Central Asia. It's a cockpit of trouble. There are threats to China from all around it, launched largely by British intelligence and by the British Commonwealth operations. So China's a besieged nation. Some years ago, my wife and I and others developed a policy for the situation, which I'll devote much of today's remarks too, and Helga also in her way. Next shot. What we've developed, and this, as you see, is a global policy. It's not just a question of a relationship between the United States and China. It's a change the entire world policy, in which the relationship between the United States and China can become the essential pivot and keystone for a global change, a much needed global change, to keep the world from collapsing into a new dark age in the coming years ahead. What we proposed, and what is at stake, is the development of a global infrastructural system which had its genesis in the work of the Lincoln administration in the United States, beginning 1861. That is, under the influence of the world's then leading economist, Henry C. Carey, the American economist. The United States entered into a development program internal to the United States called the Transcontinental Railroad. We set up a network of transcontinental railroad routes across from the Atlantic to the Pacific of the United States. These were not simply transportation routes, but these were designed as development corridors, such that for a distance of 50 to 75 kilometers on either side of the rail link, you would have agricultural and other development would be occurring. And therefore, we transformed very rapidly. In the late 19th century, we transformed the wasteland or relative wilderness areas of the middle and western United States at a rapid rate into a developing area, and from which came, in part, the great internal strength of the U.S. economy. In 1876, Europeans, including Germany and Russia, a group in Russia around Mendeleev and later around Sergei Witte, Count Sergei Witte, adopted this policy. The model of the United States from 1861 to 76 became the model for a revolution in Germany, which made Germany a world industrial power, beginning 1876, which made Russia began to become a world power through the programs of railroad building, including the Trans-Siberian Railroad, led by Mendeleev and led in part by Witte. These policies began to transform the world. What we did and have revived is which I'll describe how that happened. We revived this kind of policy to say that we must have a Eurasian land bridge based on the development of transportation routes, and the corridors along which these transportation routes would lie would become development corridors. Because when you have transportation, power, and so forth moving through an area on trunk lines, then on either side of those trunk lines of power distribution, transportation, and so forth, you have the possibility of economical development of that area to a distance of 50 to 100 kilometers on either side of that route. A highly competitive potential for development with supporting infrastructure. What we propose to do is to take the vast wastelands, the undeveloped areas of Central Eurasia, and by crisscrossing them with a number of routes of development from Central Europe, from a Paris, Vienna, Berlin triangle, which is a concentration of machine tool potential in Europe, to move these development routes across Eurasia into the United States, into the Americas, into Africa, and thus create a global development program to turn this undeveloped area of Eurasia at last into an area of development and stability, including the less developed areas of China, and to bring the whole world together in one large-scale economic development program which can be the basis for the revival and prosperity of the world economy in the coming century. That's the policy. And the function, the thing that will determine whether the summit agreement, or meeting, between the President of the United States and the President of China is successful will depend upon how that plays into making this possible. This and what it implies is the only hope for avoiding a collapse into barbarism on a world scale during the coming century. We must do it now. And the possibility of doing it lies in the hands of two men who are going to meet next week again, the President of China and the President of the United States. That is what is at stake. Nothing else is important. That is important. The future of humanity. And this summit will determine it. And therefore, I get very nasty when somebody starts to try to upset or spoil or ruin or undermine the success of this attempt at partnership between these two nations. This is crucial. Okay, now, I'll have played briefly a section from a televised press conference which I conducted in Berlin on Columbus Day, October 12th, 1988, at the Bristol-Kempinski Hotel. This is the same televised press conference which was later rebroadcast in the United States during October the same month as part of a nationwide campaign, election campaign, my campaign. This is the actual genesis. This broadcast and what led into it is the actual genesis of the program I've just described or identified, and is the genesis of the policy thinking which must go into the design of the agreements reached between the President of the United States and the President of China. Proceed. Come with me to Berlin, where I delivered a major press conference on the morning of Wednesday, October the 12th. Under the proper conditions, many today will agree that the time has come for early steps toward the reunification of Germany, with the obvious prospect that Berlin might resume its role as the nation's capital. For the United States, as for Germans and Europe generally, the question is, will this reunification process be brought about by assimilating the Federal Republic into the East Bloc's economy or economic range of influence? Or can it be accomplished in a different way? In other words, is a united Germany to come into being as a part of Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals, as President de Gaulle proposed, or as Mr. Gorbachev has desired, a Europe from the Urals to the Atlantic? I see the possibility that the process of unification could occur precisely as de Gaulle proposed. What I'd forecast at that point was that, in the remainder of that address, is that during the coming months, that we would see the disintegration of the former Soviet bloc for economic reasons. This disintegration would begin politically in Poland, would spread through Eastern Europe, and that the United States and Western Europe must prepare for this process of disintegration of the Soviet-dominated economic zone, and that the United States must support the early reunification of Germany under these conditions, and that proposal should be made in the context of offers by the United States and others to assist the states of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union in economic recovery by helping them correct some of the faults in their system. It happened, as we know, the following year. At that point, I turned to my wife, and Helga, and we discussed the implementation which had to be, this is the point the wall was beginning to crumble, the measures which must be taken by the United States and Europe, Western Europe, in order to deal with the disintegration which is ongoing in the former Soviet bloc. The proposal that came from that first was called the European Triangle Proposal. There we have that. That there is an area in Western Europe, an approximate spherical triangle whose key points, whose vertices, are Paris, Vienna, and Berlin. This is the historic, represents the historic concentration of infrastructural and related economic and technological development in Europe, which has been the greatest in the world. Here was embedded, at that time in 1988, 1989, was embedded the greatest potential for machine tool technologies, radiation from Europe into Eurasia. And my proposal was the United States had to enter into an agreement with these nations of Europe in order to establish partnership with this triangle zone in order to extend development corridors based on transportation corridors, including the technology of magnetic levitation rail, or rail substitute, into St. Petersburg, into Moscow, etc., down through Italy and so forth, and beyond, as a great development project. And we designed some of the specifications of this development of this program. These reports were published in 1990, 1991, under the title first of the European Productive Triangle. That is the development of the entire Eurasian area and other areas on the basis of mobilizing the lingering potential in this part of Europe, particularly the machine tool design capability. On this, one must remember that apart from Japan, and to some degree Korea, but that's a special case, that the problem of Asia is that the majority of the world's population is concentrated in East and South Asia. And yet only in Japan, in the whole region, do you have the machine tool capability in terms of per capita of labor force sufficient to sustain a modern economy. You cannot simply go into a barren desert and set up a factory and expect to have a productive economy. You must first of all provide infrastructure, you must provide economic transportation, water management, power, and so forth. You must have educational systems, health systems, all of these infrastructural elements which are necessary for a successful modern economy in that locality. That is, you must measure the density of infrastructure in terms of per capita of labor force, in terms of square kilometer of relevant area. In this respect, Asia is poor. The ability to transfer technology and to develop it depends upon the ratio of the number of persons employed productively in a machine tool sector industry to the total number of persons employed in the economy. There's a ratio of the rate of technological progress per capita in the machine tool sector as compared with the projected rate of technological progress per capita in the labor force as a whole. This is the key, the indispensable key to economic progress. Without it, you can't have it. Therefore, to deny Asia, as it has been denied, access to dual-use technologies, machine tool technologies. For example, in Southeast Asia, you have virtually no machine tool capability. What happens if repairs are required? Where do you go to the machine tool capability to maintain your operating plant? Where do you go to the machine tool capability to adapt a technology to your productive process? The problem is that through European colonial and other policies, East and South Asia, with the exception of Japan and to some degree Korea, South Korea, a special case, has been subjected to technological suffocation by being denied the means to develop and apply and maintain modern technology at their own discretion. We used to have some technology, for example, in the Philippines, associated with the two U.S. military bases, Subic Bay and Clark Field, especially Subic Bay. There were small machine shops and machine tool shops in the area of these U.S. military operations, which were sustained there because they helped to support the U.S. military operations. When the United States overthrew President Marcos and put the Philippines through a rapid spiral of technological and economic collapse since then, the United States pulled out of the Philippines that technological machine tool support capability, destroyed it. As a result, is the typical problem in Southeast Asia is a lack of machine tool capability. the problem of overcoming the obstacles to rapid growth in the interior of China, as opposed to some areas which are high development areas, depends upon having the machine tool capability necessary to transform and support the transformation of the relatively economically more backward portions of China into modern portions of China. In order to increase the productive powers of labor at a sufficient rate to fulfill the social objectives of China, of the Chinese government today. And therefore, the crucial thing to all of these parts of the world, whether it's Africa, South Asia, East Asia, is to provide to these sectors of the world the right to development. The right to development involves education, infrastructure development, and above all, the machine tool design capability without which you cannot have continuous sustainable development. Thus, that was the principle of the sector, that by developing land routes of efficient, high-speed transportation throughout Eurasia, and using these routes not only to support trade and industry, but to support the transmission at a high rate of the machine tool design sector into these countries, then and only then would it be possible to lift the greatest part of the world population, which is concentrated in South and East Asia, and also in Africa. Secondly, to lift these parts of the world out of the legacy of 19th century imperialism and the legacy of second-class citizenship in world affairs. Now, how did this happen? The key event, which is relevant to my role in this, occurred beginning December 1981 and to a period through 1984. In December 1981, I had run as a candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1980 against Jimmy Carter. And thus, because of the position I had there, in that respect, as a former presidential candidate, pre-candidate, and because of other things I'd done, that it was decided by some people in the U.S. government that it would be wise to have me as a private citizen respond to a Soviet probe which had requested that an additional back-channel discussion be set up between the Reagan administration and the Soviet government. So I agreed to undertake this exploratory discussion, but made one recommendation, which was conditional in the sense I said, if I'm going to be useful in this kind of discussion, there are certain things I should discuss which are of concern to me, which become the basis for this kind of exploration. I had been concerned for some time with two things. From my time of my military service in China, Burma, India theater during World War II, and I'd been concerned with establishing economic justice for the world after seeing Asia. And that had been my personal commitment, that we must change affairs so that the so-called underdeveloped or former colonial regions of the world could participate in justice. And so I've been involved heavily with third world questions and had gotten myself into a great deal of trouble in certain circles because I had been an advocate of the third world. At one time, the FBI was going to have the Communist Party of the United States assassinate me. There's a government document on that subject back in 1973 as a result of this kind of thing. But in this, the second thing I was concerned about was that the agreements on détente, which had been specifically reached during the course and aftermath of the 1962 missile crisis, were themselves a danger, a risk to civilization. That the system of détente, that is of nuclear mutual deterrence, had become the potential trigger for an accidental war. And that therefore we had to concern ourselves with this problem of ballistic missile defense. So this policy, which I had devised, which was part of my 1980 presidential campaign, a key, shall we say, plank in that campaign, was that the United States should propose to the Soviet Union and other powers that we agree on developing an efficient ballistic missile defense to be common to all powers, so that no longer would be faced the threat of thermonuclear extinction with no defense against thermonuclear warhead missiles. And that this collaboration among the United States, the Soviet Union, and other powers should be technological collaboration extended to all nations to the purpose of using these technologies, which were then called in diplomatic language new physical principles, to the benefit of the development of all mankind, with a special emphasis upon what is called then the developing sector. This was the policy which I used as the pivot of my exploratory discussions with the Soviet government during a period from February of 1982 through February of 1983. I had indications from the Andropov government that this would not be acceptable to Andropov, but they were interested in the economics. The President of the United States, various ways, adopted this idea as a good idea, President Reagan, through his people in the National Security Council with whom I was working. And on March 23rd, 1983, as you recall, the President of the United States brought in a concluding segment of his televised broadcast, announced what he called the Strategic Defense Initiative, whose content was to propose to the Soviet Union exactly what I had outlined to the Soviet government in my back-channel talks. That action by the President changed world history. It didn't change it the way I wanted it changed, because very soon the mice, including the Heritage Foundation mice, got at the operation and turned the SD around and changed its purpose. And of course, as you know, Gorbachev put me on the hit list of public enemy #1 worldwide as a result of that policy. But the fact that the policy was presented shook the world up, particularly the organizing we did around that in 1982 through 1984. The leading military and other institutions of Western Europe, the United States, and so forth, as represented by people of the senior rank in the intelligence and military institutions, were part of the groups of people who participated in supporting my policy proposals on this question. And I got into one big lot of trouble over doing that. But that concept of using these most advanced technologies, which still exist potentially, and using these as the shared technologies, shared among various nations, technologies based on expansion of the world's machine tool design capability in terms of these new technologies, should be used for transforming the world into the kind of world which, among others, President Franklin Roosevelt intended to put into effect at the end of World War had he lived to do so. President Truman had opposite policies. And that's the genesis of this particular policy, in my commitment to it. Now, let's just talk about this issue, talk about the issue of statecraft right now. It is the oligarchical tradition, not an American tradition, but an oligarchical tradition, to propose that people who are appointed by an oligarchy as the selected representatives of an oligarchy to occupy the positions of government and institutions of government are the highest ranking authorities in shaping world policy. Now, that's not true. And that's not legal under our constitutional system. The highest ranking authority socially under the American system, under our constitutional system, is the individual citizen. The most significant figure in our history, U.S. history, never occupied elective office. His name was Benjamin Franklin. He was the father of the American Revolution and the American Constitution. Everybody who played any significant role in establishing this nation was a member of a group under the direction of Benjamin Franklin. The Declaration of Independence, while written by Jefferson as the clerk of the sessions, was dictated by Benjamin Franklin. The Constitution of the United States was directed by Benjamin Franklin. A citizen of the United States who had this acting postmaster general position, which he inherited from a governor of Virginia, a lieutenant governor of Virginia, but was nonetheless a citizen. If you look around the world today, as I referred at the outset, and look at the people who occupy the highest positions of government or state, you find a miserable to mediocre lot, even by the standards of the 1950s and early 1960s. You look at the populations which presumably elect these people to office. Why do they elect mediocrities? Why do they elect people who are not capable of dealing intellectually, emotionally with the fundamental issues of our time? A case in which Zhang Zemin, the president of China, is an exception, an outstanding exception. Why are our politicians so bad? Why do we think of the neoconservatives in the U.S. Congress as the castaways, the ones that weren't sold at a rummage sale? Junk, absolute junk. Why are our institutions so corrupt? Why are the people so mediocre or so corrupt? Because the nations have become corrupt. Because the people have become corrupt. Because the majority of voters have become corrupt. Why do voters in the United States have contempt for their government? Because their government allows people like them to vote. As a matter of fact, anyone who is even competent in politics, and I know a number of people who have, the President of the United States, for example, I've never spoken to him, but I know he's a man of ideas and principle. Why doesn't he stick to principle? Why doesn't he make an honest decision on issues? Why does he waffle? Why does he backtrack? Why does he waver? Why does he adopt one policy and then the exactly contradictory policy? Why does he do that? Why are the leaders of European government? Why is the French government such a stinking mess? Nobody wants anything to do with the French state. The French state is probably, after the British state, is the most corrupt on this planet. There's no morality in it. And I know France. I can tell you the present government, the present state under Chirac, the present government under Jospin, is the most corrupt since Napoleon III. Rotten. But this is not exceptional. This is the general condition of governments today. Now what happens is people will say, as individuals or influential people will say, well, there's nothing we can do about it. It's up to the politicians. It's up to the elected officials of government. And you say, well, but should we stand by the side of the road knowing that this civilization is being destroyed and do nothing simply because we are not elected officials of governments? Are we that immoral that we'll see the world go to hell and say there was nothing we could do about it because we weren't elected? Is that what Benjamin Franklin did? Is that what Alexander Dallas Bates did? How many offices did Abraham Lincoln hold? Probably the greatest president the United States ever had. He had one, once he was elected to Congress, federal office, and once as President of the United States, for which he was shot. The greatest president in American history. What was Lincoln's influence during most of his adult life? The influence which caused him to become the president, which caused him to become, in fact, the greatest president the United States ever had. It was his role not as a public official, elected public official. It was his role as a citizen, like Benjamin Franklin. And you'll find that's true in most nations. Sometimes in good times or in fortunate times, a person of great capability, moral and intellectual capability, becomes elected to high office. But usually, especially these days, especially in this century, that is not usually the case. Usually we pick the worst people to become the elected officials. If you're not corrupt, you can't be elected. Truthfulness is a disability, a competitive disability in any election campaign in the United States. You tell the truth, you're in trouble. Many people who I know who are professional politicians have retired from office because the situation is hopeless, morally hopeless. If you tell the truth, you're doomed. Since you're not allowed to tell the truth or act truthfully or honestly, retire from office. How are people elected today in the United States, for example? They're not elected by a democratic process. Bunk. Most times, most citizens and most political candidates never meet each other. How do they meet each other? Through the media, through orchestrated operations, slushed with money. How do they get the money to run the campaigns? They sell themselves to the people who have the money. Now, who has the money in the United States today? The worst people. The very worst. The Wall Street crowd. Right? So the Wall Street crowd, or Hollywood, has the money. These are the great concentrations of financial power. And since the candidates no longer have an efficient relationship to the population, and the population has no efficient relationship to the candidates, they don't meet together and discuss policy. They say, well, I saw a slogan. Somebody told me on a news broadcast this was a good man. I see his name in the press. I hear good things about him from the rumor mill, on the gossip circuit. Yeah. My neighbor next door who raises turtles told me this is a good man. That's how we get our politicians. You don't get truth. You don't find it. For example, the justice system in the United States is monstrously corrupt. The idea of truth, for example, let's take the highest level as an example. Let's take an associate justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, probably the most influential person on the Supreme Court, Antonin Scalia. Antonin Scalia is a Satan worshiper who calls himself a Catholic. He's a Manichaean. What he says is, I have my principles, my religious principles, my moral principles, but I am not allowed to see any moral intent in the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. law. The law must be what the marketplace demands it be. The marketplace of finance, the marketplace of opinion. What I perceive to be majority opinion is law. Where's truth? Where's justice? What do we mean by injustice? We generally mean that the power, entrenched power, has committed an offense against the rights of an individual or group. That's injustice. We talk about human rights, which means that official power has either persecuted people unjustly or has tolerated it. That's called a violation of human rights. Who does that? Well, the majority does that. Or entrenched power does that. Therefore, the question of justice cannot be separated, as Plato insisted, through the mouth of Socrates. You cannot separate the question of justice from the question of truth. What kind of corruption do you have then when the highest court of the United States says that truth is of no concern to it? When it votes and says that people who have claims, evidence showing they're innocent, shall be executed for the sake of public opinion and procedure. Explicitly, no truth. There is no justice in the United States today on principle, because there's no principle of truth. You cannot bring evidence of truth into a court and win the case. You will lose it. If the court perceives that public opinion, as it chooses to perceive it, has a contrary view. So in such circumstances, it is immoral for the private citizen to say, there's nothing I can do about it. You leave it up to the politicians, the elected officials. They have the authority. Where does this idea come from about elected officials have some kind of exclusive authority? The idea of the republic is that the citizen controls elected officials by exerting that control. Not by sitting back and saying I can vote for them, against them, but by actually exerting control on the discussion and formulation of policy, of holding the institutions of government accountable for a truthful representation of the issues of policy. A real public opinion, not the kind we have that you get secondhand from the press. They have all across the river over here, they have a thing called a mass media museum. It's called a newseum. Now, these guys ain't got no class because the signs point museum. If the signs had class, they would say ad museum. Because that's the character of the news media, and that's where the people get their opinion from Hollywood. Take the case of what is Hollywood. Hollywood is very corrupt. It pays virtually no taxes. Why? Because Hollywood films, as you might guess from looking at what's on your television set, are actually funded and organized corporately in the drug money laundering centers of the world, such as the Caribbean islands. So you set up a corporation in a place like the Cayman Islands or the Dutch Antilles or someplace like that, where Russian is spoken, because the Russian gangsters are all over the place, the Russian mafia. Do it laundering money, laundering in drug money, and getting their drug deals. They set up corporations, and some of the leading actors set up corporations there. They set up a company to create a film. The film is a piece of junk, because the purpose of the film is to launder drug money. That's why you have so many. And you suspect, look, that this film was not prepared by a writer. These things are not even actors. They are something. But kicking somebody in the head or getting undressed and performing sex before a screen is not exactly high-quality classical art. Why do they do this? Because these are vehicles for laundering drug money. So how is it that some people get so rich from this stuff? Because they get rich by laundering drug money. Why doesn't Hollywood pay taxes? Because Hollywood, the great profits on distribution of these films internationally go into the drug money laundering centers, not into the distribution films based in the United States. So as long as the distribution costs match the money retained by the Hollywood or so-called domestic U.S. filmmakers, they don't have to pay much in taxes. So therefore, what do you have in the Hollywood mafia? The actors who, through these arrangements with the drug money cartels, have millions of dollars to spend. The great funders of campaigns, the great moral paragons of the United States. I want my daughter to look like this actress. I want my son to look like that. I want to dress like that. My son wants to marry a woman who looks like that actress. My daughter wants to marry a man who looks like that actor. This is a surrogate royalty for the illusion-ridden American. This is an example of our moral degradation. Our educational system. Most young people coming out of educational systems today, even universities, would not qualify to graduate from a decent secondary school back in the 1960s and 1950s. They don't know anything. They haven't been taught anything. They've been taught junk. They've been put through a sociological drill of political correctness. So we sit and we watch our nation being destroyed. We sit and watch our children being destroyed. We sit and watch genocide. Take the genocide case. Well, we're now becoming demographically aged because people don't know how to make babies anymore. Only if you're uneducated and very poor, you haven't unlearned how to make babies. So what happens to us? If you get sick, you're likely to die. Why? For the greater profits of the insurance companies, who move in and make rules whose purpose is to accelerate the death rates among people who have severe illness or who are simply old. What is going on in our hospitals, in our medical system, through the health management organizations and through the insurance companies and behind them is a systematic mass murder which differs in no principal respect from what went on in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Mass murder, the morbidity rates, which are among victims of disease and of risk age groups, is rising. The hospital system we built in the post-war period, over the period from the late 1940s into the middle of the 1970s, is being destroyed. People are being murdered for the sake of Wall Street's profits today. This is upheld as being legal. Statutes are written to favor this operation. Government budgets are designed to favor this operation. The latest one is to eliminate pensions altogether on demographic economic grounds. So we have this immorality which takes over government and becomes recognized as mainstream opinion, and the government defends committing crimes and stupidities in the name of the authority of mainstream opinion. Just like this anti-Christian Manichaean. It's like you could say of Justice Scalia. Just because you want to be a good churchgoer doesn't mean you have to be a Catholic. You don't have to be a Christian to be a good churchgoer. You just have to keep up the appearances and stick to mainstream opinion. And that's what we got. So what do you do? Well, where's the American idea come from? You look at the history of our founders of our nation. The influence which shaped this country was that of Gottfried Leibniz, specifically, in opposition to Locke. Our culture, our political culture, does not come from the British empiricist system, or from Locke, or Adam Smith. Our culture comes from the European tradition, which is transmitted through Leibniz. The ideas, the philosophy of Franklin were those of Leibniz. The Declaration of Independence enshrines the principles of Leibniz, which Leibniz composed in opposition to Locke. The preamble of the U.S. Constitution, federal Constitution, is a statement of Leibnizian highest law, constitutional law of the land. Where do we get these ideas? Well, our founders, the best of them, the leaders of them, were educated in classical Greek. And our ideas of the citizen came from study of the aspirations of a society based on citizenship as expressed in classical Greek, particularly the case of Solon, the great tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles, and especially Plato. The idea of the philosopher king, the citizen who developed intellectually, morally, who developed the responsibility, especially as they aged, the responsibility for taking care of their people and their government. The so-called Good Samaritans of their society. The people whose mission in life, whose adopted and developed mission in life is to take care of their nation and its people, and to take care of humanity as a whole, and to try to make their nation a good nation for the benefit of all humanity. It is we who have to do this. Fortunately, for various reasons, I developed a very strong sense of that kind of purpose. And thus in the way I indicated, and also in other ways, became internationally somewhat significant as the philosopher king, as a citizen, not elected to any office, but often dealing with governments and dealing with influential people, traveling around the world, communicating around the world, trying to make this country a good country, not only for itself and its people, but a good country for all mankind, a good friend of all mankind, a good friend of all the nations and peoples of this planet. And thus I've developed these concepts and been involved in these operations like this one. Now let me just turn to the next slide. And I call upon all of you to do likewise, if you can. And, what is a human being? That's the question that really is there. I think that the President of China is a man who could understand this. Probably already does. The President of the United States, if he could get rid of certain problems, could also probably understand this. It might take a wrestling match, but we can probably get to understand. What is a human being? That's what's at issue in this. We have a planet, over 5 billion people. What are they? We have people who say that human beings are nothing but animals. We have this guy, Peter Singer, an Australian, who was essentially kicked out of a conference because he was denying human rights in favor of animal rights. People no longer know what a human being is. Some people, like the Prince Philip, the consort of the Queen of England, said that man is nothing but a higher ape. And I say, well, are you speaking of your children, sir? People have those ideas that man, what is man? The economists lie. Every brand of economics generally taught and practiced in the world today is based on the assumption that there is no difference between a man and a monkey. Because where is the difference between man and ape located in the design of those ideas of economics? Since apes, all apes together, combined, never had a potential population in excess of several million people under the conditions which have existed on this planet in the past 2 million years. Never. How did we reach the level of a couple 100 million world population during the Hellenistic and Roman period, early Roman period? How did we reach several 100 million population worldwide by the 14th century? And how from the 15th century have we had an ascending growth of population and standard of living on this planet of over 5 billion people today? How did that happen? Why aren't we down at just 3 million or 4 million, as we should be if we were a million ape? What's the difference? The difference is what we call scientific and technological and cultural progress. Where does this come from? Where does this progress come from? It comes from the discovery of principles, such as principles of physics, principles of the universe, scientific discoveries, cultural, artistic discoveries. That's where it comes from. Where does this come from? Why can't monkeys do it? Why do we allow people to monkey with our government? Because the individual personality has a quality which is absolutely different than that of any animal. Only a human being can discover a principle, an idea. Only a human being can unlock the secrets of the universe. Only a human being can unlock the secrets of the powers of the human mind itself, as we do with great classical art. Therefore, that is the source of power. That is the source of economy. What is economy? Economy is man's relationship to the universe. That is man's existence in terms of man's effective, willful relationship to the universe. What do we do when we discover a principle? We change man's relationship to nature. We increase man's power over nature by unlocking the secrets of nature through the powers of discovery which are located in the individual mind. What is history? Real history is the history of ideas. Ideas which represent the accumulation of discoveries which have been made by those who came before us. History is the history of those ideas. What is education? Education is allowing young children, whether in the family or in schools, to re-experience the active discovery of those great principles which are the heritage we have from generations before us. What do we produce by education? By that kind of education. Not textbook education, but that kind of education. You must relive the act of discovery. We produced a mind which understands what a human being is because they have relived an essential part of the history of all humanity through reenacting these discoveries. We have a mind which is trained to do what? To use the power it has and which it has developed to make new and better discoveries than those who came before. What do we call that? The generic term for that is education, or to distinguish it from the kind of miseducation people get in schools today, or I guess they call it miseducation. Right? You get in schools today. That we call it classical education. because it's based on the classical conception, which we attribute generally to classical Greece and European civilization, the tradition of Plato, that you must relive history. You must relive it in terms of how man's relationship to nature changed, how man's relationship to man improved. That's real history. And therefore we call reliving that in a student, reliving history, the history of ideas, classical education. So therefore the center of economy, the first principle of economy is that. Now what do we do in good education, particularly in higher education? You produce young people, as Lazare Carnot and Gaspard Monge did in France prior to 1814. In brigades of young people taken in from the farms and so forth as talented young people and made into the great scientists and engineers of France in that period. You take part of the population, you put through an educational process, and you produce people, thinkers, great thinkers. They develop new discoveries. Now, when you make a discovery, you have to prove it, don't you? You think you've discovered a solution. You have to prove the solution. What do? Well, in modern times, you create an experiment, sometimes called a crucial experiment. Sometimes it takes the form of a laboratory experiment. Sometimes it takes the form of work with a telescope or something else. But you produce an experiment. You design an experiment. The experiment is designed to test whether or not you can prove that the principle you think you've discovered actually works. Now you keep doing that until you get this thing right. When you get this right, when you get a very good refined experiment, which proves things one way or the other, what do? You walk over to a machine tool design shop, probably the same one that helped you build the laboratory equipment. And in that machine tool shop, they say this principle works. Now they proceed to develop new kinds of designs of products, new kinds of productive processes based on this machine tool principle. Right? So therefore you have, once you start with the idea that there's something sacred and special about the individual person, this creative potential, now you create an educational system and a social process which is centered on that principle, the principle of the citizen which is born with a divine spark of reason in each individual, to cultivate that citizen and to develop that citizen, that individual, as a true citizen, a thinking person, a person who knows how to think. And the citizens then choose among themselves in a good society who their leaders shall be in terms of government and other functions. That is a true republic. Right? But economy comes from that. The success of economy comes from that. So we educate everybody. Give every newborn child that kind of education. And you produce a powerful society because every person is powerful. You no longer have two-tier societies, which you have oligarchs on top, some lackeys who do errands for them, like military and other lackeys beyond them, and then the people, who are treated like human cattle, who do their job, who are not taught anything except what they need to do the job assigned to them. Human cattle, serfs, slaves, are similar conditions. Now we say everybody in society, every newborn child, must have this kind of development. And this development must go, if we can do it, if we can afford it, to the level we call the university level today. In order to develop every personality to the fullest potentiality, moral and intellectual and scientific potentiality of that mind, which is, in a sense, the President of China exemplifies that kind of objective in a personality, as other leaders of China, whom I know, have that kind of quality. Now, on the basis of developing artistic or political, statecraft or scientific ideas, you now go into changing production. Why can you change production? Well, you apply the machine tool principles to make new designs of products, better infrastructure, better productive processes. Why does it work? Because on the other side, the labor force you've educated is qualified to go in and be confronted with new technologies and to be able to make them work. For example, you had in the Soviet economy, which I studied for many years, you had a two-tier Soviet economy. On the one side, you had the military, scientific, industrial complex. Now, this was one of the best scientific cadres in the world. I have certain criticisms of their philosophy, but they worked. They made things work. They made junk work. Worse junk than we produce. They made it work. But then you had those in the Soviet society who didn't have that level of education, lived on another tier, the civilian society. These were the people who were resistant to technological progress, which the Soviet officials privately used to call the peasant problem. You had people who, because of a lack of cultural development, were unable to cope with technological progress, who had an attitude of refusing to cope with technological progress if they could avoid it. And that was the inner weakness, the greatest inner weakness of the Soviet economy, was the peasant problem. The inability of large masses of the population employed in the civilian sector to be able to match the level of performance which was achieved in the military scientific complex. How do you overcome that? It's a problem which China is trying to deal with now. How do you create the circumstances, given a population of over 1 billion people, how do you create the circumstances in which you can uplift the poor families into this level of dignity and education? You have to have the means to do so. You have to have the economic means to do so, the physical economic means. You have to have the life expectancy and conditions of social life in the family so this can occur, which is the Soviets never faced, never actually successfully addressed. So therefore, by having a developed labor force engaged with technological progress in the workplace and similar places, you have the formula for success, the formula under which the cost of producing an individual is less than the productivity of the society as measured in physical terms. Those are the conditions of progress. What we have to do is do that on a planetary basis. Now, in the oligarchical society, what is the famous statement? You hear it in the United States, you hear it in Europe. Don't educate people above their station. Do not provide people an education which might equip them to do something, the kind of work or live the kind of life they're never going to have the opportunity to have. This goes back in European history to the Code of Diocletian. If your father was a baker, you must be a baker. And you must use the same methods your father used, and your grandfather, and his father before him, his grandfather before him. It was this philosophy which destroyed the Byzantine Empire from within, which depopulated it by this policy of zero technological growth. Stay in your place. We don't want to educate everybody because they're only going to be paper shufflers or do service work. We don't want to over-educate people. And thus you have the mentality of a two-tier society. Similarly, you say in politics, we don't want the people involved in deciding policy. We want government to do as government is told to do. We wish to control government. We wish to determine who can get into government. We wish to control them, whether by legal harassment, as they're doing to Clinton, or something else. Control them, threaten them, break them, get rid of them if they don't do our bidding. The constituency of government then becomes, as in the United States, Hollywood and Wall Street. If Hollywood, the daily mass media, and Wall Street do not want something to happen, it is not supposed to happen. This is called the establishment. The establishment decides what kind of government you shall have and who shall occupy the seats of government. The people have given up. 51% of the Americans, at least, eligible voters, don't register to vote. Because they probably consider that an act of corruption, of condoning this rotten system. And they're partly right. They're morally wrong, but their judgment on the system is correct. So that's the kind of system. That's the kind of system that's wanted. For example, Lord William Rees-Mogg. He's a madman, but he was formerly chief editor of the London Times, which is the publication which broadcast British foreign policy before the British Foreign Office knew about it. And this gentleman has said the objective is to create a society of the type that people like Alvin Toffler or Newt Gingrich or Al Gore want. A kind of society which would be called a New Age society, a New Era society. information society, in which only 5% of the population will receive any education at all. And they will control the world through information, while the 95% of the rest will receive no education. This is the kind of society which is described in the last story of Jonathan Swift's famous Gulliver Travels, which is really a story about a visit to early 18th century England, in which the society was governed by the rear ends of horses, and the mass of the people were called yahoos, not to be confused with Netanyahu's. And the yahoos spoke no articulate speech. They did all the work, manual labor, and spent the rest of the time rutting in the ditches. And they were going to castrate poor Gulliver because they thought he was a talking Yahoo and they didn't want any of those. So they were going to castrate him so he couldn't breed any more of that kind. That's the kind of objective, that's the kind of way they think. So you have a government which is based on the oligarchical principle, in which the citizens who are not in the establishment, who are not in controllers of the mass media, who are not Hollywood actors and actresses, whatever sex they have, that they will keep their mouths shut, except if they're elected to official positions in government, in which case they will do as they're told or be thrown out. That's the kind of society we have, an oligarchical society run essentially by Wall Street, the establishment, and Hollywood, and the British. We no longer have a society which is functioning as the United States was constitutionally designed to be, a nation based on citizens who had a sense of truthfulness, a commitment to knowledge, who would decide and take care, like the Good Samaritan in the New Testament, who would take care of the nation, the people, those who had fallen by the side of the road, and would work to seek care that their nation, above all, just as they cared what they became, would care also what their nation became, and what their nation was in respect to other nations. Was it good, beneficial to the world, or was it bad? And that's what we must do again. And that's what I've done. And because of this situation, we've come into a time when there are very few of us, and I know the world, I think, very well, better than most. I've dealt with many countries over many decades, increasingly. I know most of the governments of the world, how they think, what they've done, what mistakes they've made, what traps they've fallen into, what foolishness they do today. Very few people know what is happening to the world. They know less about economics than anything else, which they do the most talking about. And the higher you are in economic policy making, generally the less you know, the less competent you are. Because you don't recognize that economy was be based on the principle of the individual creative powers of the individual mind. Profit doesn't come from cheap labor. Profit comes from the development of the individual mind and providing the conditions of life which are necessary to the development of those conditions of mind. All this accepted economics is totally incompetent, but people accept this. Sociology is taught incompetent. Virtually everything taught in our universities today is incompetent, it's rubbish. Nobody cares. They care about passing the course, not whether they're learning anything or not. They want the job. They are like the musician who sings to earn his supper, not for the benefit of music. They don't care. So that the number of people on this planet who are well informed and well organized, at least in relative terms, are very few. And they're mostly outside of most governments. You'll find very few people, a very tiny percentage of people in any government in the world today who are competent even by the standards of the 1970s, early 1980s. Virtually none. Any leading politician from the 1960s, 70s, or 80s would and does look with contempt upon the majority of the politicians who are elected today. And justly so. We have a junk heap. We have a swamp, not a Congress, a swamp. And we're not quite sure what species are in there. Therefore, it falls upon those of us who do know, who are few, to do what we can, like the Good Samaritan, to ensure that the ideas that are needed are provided, and to provide leadership. And that's the role I've played. That's been my motivation, my concern in doing what I've indicated. Now, as I say, the time has come. In the meeting between the two presidents, it will be a turning point in world history, up or down. If the summit were to fail, if it were to fail in establishing the kind of partnership understanding between the two powers which is needed for this world, then I wouldn't give you too much for the prospects of the entire human race over the coming decades. And thus we have to be concerned at this point to provide to such few leaders and others who are willing to hear, to provide the policies, the programs, the outlooks which are needed in a time when virtually no one on this planet, none of the institutions in power, have the slightest idea of what has to be done to save this world from hell. Thank you.